Welcome back to the Chess Channel. Mike and Felix here, and we have a beautiful game for you today with one of the most colorful characters in chess history, Nicholas Rossolimo. Nicholas was a very strong grandmaster, and at one point in his career actually was in the top 20 in the world. He won the Paris Championship 7 times and tied for first with Sammy Rejevsky in the US Open. But Mike, I know you know a lot more about Rossolimo, and especially since you have a connection to him.
Yeah, that's right, Felix. Thank you. So I used to work at a place called the Chess Forum on Thompson Street in Lower Manhattan, Greenwich Village, when I was in college at NYU. And I came to find out a couple of months into it, it was known as the Rossolimo Chess Studio at one time, named after the famous grandmaster. And he's just a very interesting guy. He spoke many languages. When he came to the country, he didn't really have very much, and he had some odd jobs as a cab driver, as a waiter. But eventually he did open this Rossolimo Chess Studio, and it was a pretty interesting place. You had a lot of famous artists like Marcel Duchamp who would come by, and they come by and just kind of discuss just what's happening in the area and during the times in New York City. But they also just enjoyed some chess with a really strong player. But we can talk about that a little more going into the game now. White started pawn to e4.
All right, Mike, we'll get right into this game, and as you'll see that Rossolimo played in a romantic classical style. The game starts off as a well-known Guicco Piano opening, and I tell my students this all the time. In the beginning of the game, you're playing towards the middle of the board, and if you're not sure what to move, I tell them pawn, knight, bishop. Just move a pawn, knight, or bishop into the middle of the board, and you notice both players have done this. Now, Mike, c3 is a very odd move here for most players, so can you explain this move to us?
Sure. So pawn c3, it's not really about putting the pawn there, it's about where he wants to go later. And so the idea is a preparatory move, and he's going to break open the center with the move pawn to d4. It looks a little slow. In fact, Guicco Piano translated means the quiet game. But as you'll see, after knight f6, d4, and it's anything but quiet here. Okay, so they exchange off, and then bishop to b4 check.
All right, on bishop b4, we have reached the crossroads in this game, Mike. The king is in check, and there are 2 ways out of check here that make sense. Knight c3 is the beginning of what could be called a Muller attack, and bishop d2 is the more solid move that's played in the game. Now, for our newer players, I always tell them in these types of positions, don't move your king out of check, because right. If you move your king, then your king is going to be stuck in the middle and you won't be able to castle.
That's right. So after they exchange off, bishop takes.
Wow, look at this, Mike. White has completely taken that middle of the board. The question is, how should black respond to this?
Yeah, it looks pretty scary there. I mean, white's accomplished at first glance just a dominant position. But if you're playing black here, you can't let this stand very long. What you have to do is you have to challenge the center, and that's exactly what black did in this position.
Okay, pawn d5 strikes back in the center.
Nice counter-attacking move there.
Yes, yeah. and it breaks up that center for white. Doesn't let him have complete control.
Okay, so we have an exchange off there. And then, actually, let me back up 1 second. Okay, so pawn takes, knight takes, and now
queen
an interesting
to d3.
move. Yeah.
And this is a move that I like to play in these positions. I like setting up the battering ram where the queen and the bishop are both attacking on that diagonal, looking at the f-pawn. And this looks like a very strong move. And back in those days, without the help of computer databases and all the programs that we have now, it was much harder for them to figure out opening strategies. But we know now that knight a5 is actually a move that black can play to equalize in this position. But I like this position still. You see that bishop e6, if we wanted to play that, to protect the knight, would actually leave the pawn on b7 hanging. So it's a tough position for black to figure out what to do. And what does he play here, Mike?
So he retreats the knight on c6, brings it to e7, and he also makes room for the c7 pawn to come to c6, which will help aid the knight as well.
Very nice. White castles, very solid move. Simple, get the king out of the middle of the board. And black plays pawn to c6, protecting his knight some more. And in these positions, masters of this strafe, they just play nice and simple, solid moves. He just improves his position by putting his rook on the open file and pinning the king. Now the king has castled. And here comes, I would say, probably the trickiest move to talk about in this game. Pawn to a4, and this is a move that is hard for most people to understand, but these are moves that masters play all the time. Mike, can you explain this move?
Sure, I'll try my best here. So white enjoys a little bit of a space advantage, and he's got a nice bishop on c4. He doesn't want black to be able to play pawn to b5, which kicks the bishop out. So the pawn on a4 now helps, because obviously he'll just win a pawn if that move is played. But in addition to that, he's probing a little bit. He's maybe looking to expand on the queen side and push the pawn up to a5, maybe even up to a6 if his opponent lets him. But then there's a more subtle reason. He's going to lift the rook up later in the game, or at least he has the option to bring the rook into the game via a3 and then sliding it over on the third rank. May not seem like much now, but it turns out to be an unbelievably strong idea.
Well, this is a great place to pause this game. We're going to pick it up in part 2 of our game here. Please join us for part 2.